Good morning. We're back. Hopefully, everybody had a good weekend. Today's stream, we're going to get right to the point, right to the nitty gritty, because today is, for us teachers, is submission. What was it? We are trying to submit all of our attendance, and it's going to be pretty crazy. Trying to get all that done and making sure everybody's submitting assignments, and I have quite a few people who are missing their Industrial Revolution ad. I assigned it, I want to say like Tuesday or Wednesday last week, and it was due by Sunday night. So if it is not in, you don't have a lot of time, being honest with you. So make sure you guys go ahead and get that submitted and done. Today we're going on to a not so funny part. We're going to be talking about, well, definitely not funny whatsoever. We're going to be talking about the plantation system and slave life. What was it like for slave? How did the slave trade really get into? And this is going to be several different PowerPoints. We have to go from today. We're actually going to jump over the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to do that tomorrow because it's a much more time. That's going to be a very long stream tomorrow. That's going to be a particularly lengthy amount of time going through and having to go over quite a bit of things. We're going to talk about the triangular trade, all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be a longer PowerPoint to go through. But today we're going to do slave life on the plantation. So we're going to see what life is pretty much like for these slaves, how the plantation system worked. It's a fairly small, it's only 13 slides, I think, PowerPoint. And we're going to go through this together. You'll see that there is a discussion board now on Schoology for you guys to complete. That is an assignment. It is graded. So you will see that now it is a graded assignment, unlike last week, which was more just to see, hello, who's here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you watching live, welcome back in. And those of you who are watching later, hopefully you guys are having a good time wherever you are now. Hopefully everyone's staying safe and healthy and all those things. So it's making it through. So I don't have my sunglasses with me, which makes me feel very, very weird. Well, at least I thought I did. I don't. It's whatever. I probably left them downstairs. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're, again, going to be talking about slave life and plantation. So let's head over to Mr. Robinson's PowerPoint Central. Boop. All right. So slave life on a plantation. Now, a couple things. Many of us do know from having done the colonies work, we know a plantation is simply a massive agricultural place. Okay, it's a huge farm. It's what is best to describe, and it's usually run by thousands of people. Okay, well, thousands, about 1,000 people to several hundred. It is a massive farm that usually is more industrial than normal. Like if you think of like a small person, like a little small farm, someone who grows, cabbage and things like that, that's more self-sustainable. This is more for industrial purposes. So what they're growing down here is the cash crops. We've talked about the cash crops, right? Those are the crops that were grown in the South with that, not for maintaining, sustaining. So those are things like food and staple crops like wheat, oats, corn, barley, potatoes, things like that. These are crops that you grow specifically to make money. So these are things that you could not sustain on, you can't live on, like tobacco, sugar, cotton, rice, indigo. You're trying to produce these large, these financially more profitable items. So, on that note, what we're talking about is slave life on a plantation. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, first, we're going to be able to describe the characteristics of slave life on plantations in the South. So we need to know what it was like for these slaves who lived on these plantations, who were working for no pay. Oop, I think I hit the wrong. No, I hit the right button. Okay, so first and foremost, plantations were largely estates owned by very wealthy Southerners. When we're talking about wealthy, we're talking like really rich. Okay, so these people would own hundreds, if not thousands, of acres worth of land, and they were able to go ahead and produce large amounts of these cash crops, right? They usually had several buildings on them, a mansion, slave houses, smoke houses, barns, and other buildings that were different for used for different purposes. So it's not just like a little barn that you would see. Good morning, Lily. And it's not like these little barns that you would go and find on a little farm. These were massive institutions. Now, most of the work was done on plantations was done by slaves. Now, one of the biggest misnomers is that many Southerners in the South had slaves. In fact, the vast majority of them didn't. Okay, slaves were very expensive at that point. If you keep in mind, remember, slavery was the concept of slavery was most of the slaves, the vast majority, I don't even want to give percentages because my percentage won't be correct, but it is well over 2/3 of all owned slaves or owned by a very small number of people. Okay. Now, moving forward, what we're going to see, though, is this. Oh, did I hit a button? No, I didn't. We're good. Okay. Now, what were slaves doing on these plantations? Well, they were doing the work that most people wouldn't want to do, right? They're doing the work that the vast majority of people would not be willing to do on their normal time, or it's also the most in time-consuming and labor-conducive jobs, right? Slaves did anything and everything that was needed to be done on the plantation. They would basically did all the jobs that would be required of a small town. Okay, these jobs include planting, picking, and tending to the crops in the field, cooking and cleaning, raising livestock, butchering meat, preparing food, salting and smoking meat. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And any other work that really needed to be done. And slaves had actually a lot more leeway than many people give them credit for. Many times slaves would actually go into town and go and pick up things for the plantation. They would go and buy things and secure things for their masters. And many of them would leave the plantation, go into town, go buy a couple things, and come home, and without much to do of anything. And most people would think, well, Mr. Robinson, why wouldn't they just run away? Why wouldn't they just leave? Well, many of them would not be able to think to do so. And as we go through our slavery unit this week, you're going to realize it's not as easy as just, make a dash for it and run. There's a lot of systems that were put into place in the South to ensure that slaves didn't run away. Now, when it says salting and smoking meat, what they're doing ultimately is that back in the old days, we didn't have refrigerators. So if you slaughtered an animal and you had the meat, it's going to go bad very quickly. Unless you do one of two things. You either cook it ahead of time and smoke it, which means that meat will last for longer because it has natural preservatives, or you salt the meat, which is the most natural preservatives. By placing salt in the meat, it can, if you've ever had beef jerky and things like that, that's really cured and salted meat. At that point, yes, it's very strong in the flavor because of a lot of salt in it, but it also stops it from decomposing and stops it from breaking down, and you can keep meat longer. So if you're going, most people can't eat an entire cow within 2 days, so you're going to have to, salt the meat and do things to make it last longer. So that was one of the jobs that they had, but primarily they were mostly out in the fields, if not tending to those in the home. Okay. Now, you also had different types of slaves, and a lot of times these slave jobs were dependent on personality, physical stature, strength, all sorts of things went into this. You had outside work and inside work, because there were those who maintained this, the plantation's day-to-day agricultural functions, which is like working out in the fields, working out on the farm as a whole, and then you had the day-to-day inside functions, maid work, tending to children, things of that nature. So outside slaves were what they would consider lower-class slaves. These are slaves that may have just were there primarily for physical labor. Okay, it was tough because they worked in all conditions, whether it was raining, snowing, sleet, storms, and heat. They were out working. Okay, and they usually had hard labor from sun up to sundown. So from roughly 5 to 6 a.m. until 7 to 8 o'clock at night, they were out there working. Now, inside labor or inside work was considered for good slaves. These were slaves that they trusted. A lot of times these were the ones who were high of intellect and were friendly and trustworthy. And the reason why they would do this is because these were the people who would be working in their homes. Now, I know what all of this sounds absolutely morbid and terrible that we're discussing human beings in this way. And absolutely, in modern view of historical understanding, it is crazy to think that this was the accepted nomenclature or the accepted vocabulary that we would use when discussing human beings. But back then, they did not see them as human beings. They were seen as property. Okay. Now, they were treated better by the plantation owner and oftentimes would be given better food to eat, would wear better clothes, and have much less difficult time doing their work. And part of that was because when these slave owners and these plantation owners would let people into their homes, you don't want to see someone wearing raggedy old clothes and things like that you would see on those outside laborers. You'd want to see someone well-dressed and maintained in the home, right? So it's a part of, it's this idea of class system that was primarily used with the outside work versus inside work. So you can see these are some pie recipes. That's kind of fun to look at. Looking at how, these are the kind of things that they would do. Many of these inside slave holders would do is they would have them make food and cook and clean. And many of the times you'd actually see slaves be nannies. So they would watch the children and do those things. And they wouldn't educate them, but they would definitely tend to their day-to-day needs. Okay. Now, most slaves, those were, when we talk about the outside slaves, they lived in what they called a slave house, right? These are usually small little cabins located on the plantation. Slaves' houses would oftentimes house up to 20 people in these small little houses, and primarily it's to keep costs down, right? They would often share bunks and things like that to maintain their day-to-day life. This is how they would do this. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that they were fed poorly. Not necessarily. The difference is that many of these slaves, on top of the work that they had to do on the plantation, they also grew their own food. Okay, so they would actually have to grow their own food, cook their own food, maintain their own food after their work was completed. So their day was much longer than many people would back then would give it credit for. So yeah, they worked from sun up to sundown tending to the plantation, but they also had to find time to tend to their own food and things of that nature. So that it made their lives much, much more difficult. Now, things that they would eat, slaves did not always get to eat good food, like you or I may eat, but slave owners wanted to save money, so they would often feed their slaves the bare minimum, if not making them cook their own food. Now, while some slave owners treated slaves better than others and gave them decent food, many were forced to eat things like mush, which showed on the right, which is simply just a big mixture of cornmeal. It's nothing great. It's enough to keep them satisfied, or by satisfied I mean enough to keep them fed and bare nutrition, but it's not great. But that's why many slaves took to raising their own farms, maintaining their own crops for their own food, for them to cook themselves. And this is one of the problems that we face when talking about such a dark part of human and U.S. history in particular, is not all slave owners were the same. There were many slaves that treated people very, very well and treated them with the utmost respect and kindness. And there were owners who were absolutely horrifying and treated them in barbaric and brutal ways. And it depended on who you were. And so granted, the concept of owning a slave in slavery is immoral, downright terrible, tragic, and disgusting. But at the same time, it's not universally the same, depending on where you come from. So it's all a matter of whether or not you keep up with it's whether or not how do you apply this view of slavery. And as we go through this week, you're going to realize it's very difficult to constantly maintain and watch and observe all these things using your 2020 human lens, because like when you're looking at history, you're thinking of things in a 2020 centric point of view. So you're thinking of how I would view if this were happening right now. But the hardest part is you have to put your mind into 1790s through 1860s point of view, where many of these people were raised for generations owning slaves. They don't know any better. One of the examples, and it's not to say it's right or wrong, is kids who grow up on farms. They're much more accustomed to. Hold on, guys. I'm going to have to put you on a brief pause. So if you give me just a second, we will be right back. Sorry, I've got a important phone call to take. So give me one moment. This is a school-related call, just to make sure. So please wait for a second. All right. I think we're back. I have to get to the right screen. So if you guys just give me a moment. Sorry. Had an emergency phone call, but we're live. All right. So we're back. Apologize about the wait. Love the elevator music. Always gives us and keeps us in touch. All right. So where was I? We were talking about how slaves are being treated, looking at it from a 2020 perspective. But a lot of history is really difficult to do, and we've talked about this in class, I'm sure, a bunch of times, where when we look at history, we have to strip away our view of how we view the world now and view it back then. So if you grew up living on a farm, okay, if you're like modern day, if you grew up living on a farm, it is a lot easier for them to mentally process the concept of raising an animal for slaughter, right? You have to raise a pig or a cow or something that you know one day is going to go off to the slaughterhouse and is going to be made into, a ham or into a hamburger, right? And for some city kids, they can't fathom the concept of raising an animal only to know it's going to be slaughtered one day. That's difficult, right? Me personally, I can't imagine doing that. But I've talked to numerous kids who've grown up on farms and people who've grown up on farms. And that's just a part of everyday life. That's just what you do, right? And you're raised to think that way. And there are some people who could never fathom doing this, ever, for no matter what, no reason whatsoever, right? A lot of our animal rights activist people could never contemplate doing that. But at the same time, it's very difficult to put one's own personal view in perspective. So when we're talking about slavery, we have to talk about it as objectively as possible, because for many people, it wasn't a moral issue. It wasn't discussing what is the difference between right and wrong. But Mr. Robinson, owning a human being is morally repugnant and terrible. I agree with you. In the current modern 2020 world version, that is true. But if you go back historically, owning human beings has existed for millennia. It has existed for thousands of years. And to go back and call all of these people horrific and terrible and barbaric, I mean, what they were doing in modern view is wrong, absolutely. But we also have to take into consideration the moral code and the way the world works was much different back then. If you don't believe me, go back and watch a bunch of episodes of Friends. You're going to find some jokes and storylines that by modern standards in 2020, and we're talking about a show that was on in the 90s, you would never get away with on modern day television anymore, because they would be, I know there's a whole storyline in Friends, which is now considered transphobic, being against transgendered people. But it made sense, but it wasn't inappropriate at the time. But modern times and cultural points of view and standard points have changed. So we have to keep that in consideration when we're going through this, right? I gotta put my mouse over here. There we go. Now, how were slaves treated? And ultimately, this is where we run into issues. Now, clearly, we're looking at a visual example. Good morning, Avery. We're looking at a terrible example of how slaves were treated. And oftentimes, they were treated very harshly. And when we get to later on PowerPoints this week, we're going to have some specific examples of this. But this one is just a very vanilla blanket overview to get the discussion going on what we think of slavery, right? Now, slavery is forced work, right? Since there was no paycheck for slaves to collect, they didn't have money as a motivation to work hard. Okay, so for you guys, school-wise, you work hard, so you get a good grade, right? Good grades equal something else for you. For many of you, it's like I get good grades, I can get to a good school, I go to a good school, I get a good job, I get a good job, I get good money, I have a good life. There you go. Now, what if you didn't have any what we call tangible reward? So there is no financial gain to get out of school. You only have intrinsic reward, which is something that, like, for example, I work hard to be a good teacher because I know that I'm motivating and helping develop the future children of America. That's an intrinsic reward. I get nothing from that, right? I don't get anything for Hudson doing good in school. I get nothing for Avery becoming a great person. I get paid my salary, but I could just do the bare minimum and get you by and technically keep my job. But at the same time, if I do like the fact that I get to see my kids grow up to become much more successful and better equipped to handle the world than I ever was, that's an intrinsic reward for me. I'm very proud of where my students grow up to, what they grow up to be, and where they go on. I mean, most of them, I'm sure, if they become international murderers and drug dealers, I'm not super proud. But hey, what I'm saying is, ultimately, there's a difference between extrinsic and intrinsic reward. Slavery was a unique situation. You had neither. there was no intrinsic reward for many of them to do their job very well. They didn't necessarily feel very good. Then you also didn't have very many extrinsic rewards either. They weren't really getting anything for it. Really what they were doing was trying to comply with their owners so they wouldn't get punished. So this is like what many students deal with their home. They don't do good in school because they want to do good in school. They do good in school so they don't get punished by their parents for not doing well in school. Now, we're not comparing the punishments of slaves to children, but you're looking at it from a negative reward-based system. So as opposed to, hey, you did good, here's a candy bar. It's, hey, you did bad, go do 100 push-ups. So they're looking at it from this perspective. Now, they weren't allowed to read or write because the owners didn't want them to get smart. And that was a huge factor in this. And in fact, it wasn't just the owners who didn't want it to happen. Many states did not want this to happen. Excuse me. Little spit got in there. Many of these slave owners did not want this to happen specifically because, you know, the old saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. So what does that mean? If you're smart, you don't really need a sword because you'll find your way out of a negative situation without having to resort to violence. Well, if slaves realized the nature of their condition and how they could get around it and get out of it, they were afraid of slave uprisings. And one of your assignments this week, we're going to talk about a man by the name of Nat Turner, one of the most famous slave rebellions of all time. And it ended in a very unfortunate situation in which many people were executed. And we'll also talk later on. We'll talk about Harper's Ferry, another attempted slave revolt that ended in the execution of a man by the name of John Brown, and was one of the linchpins to the creating the Civil War. Now, ultimately, most of these slaves had to have what we call a system that they had to complete a certain number, a quota system, if you will. So you had to pick a certain amount of cotton. Now let's just imagine that Connor, in this case, because I see Connor's in the chat right now, or at least he was. Connor is a slave, okay? Connor needs to pick at least 3 pounds of cotton today. If he doesn't pick 3 pounds of cotton, well, Connor's in for a little bit of trouble, okay? So for every ounce of cotton he falls short, I'm going to give him 10 lashes. Okay, so he picks 10 pounds or let's say he picks 2 pounds and 10 ounces of cotton. Well, he fell 6 ounces short, okay, of maintaining his quota. So that's 10 lashes for every ounce he missed. So he gets 60 lashes. Okay, if you don't know what a lash is, it's when you get hit by a whip. Okay, 60 lashes to his back. Usually this is pretty brutal. It's going to be very painful. But here's the problem. He still owes me 6 lashes. He still owes me 6 lashes. Okay? So tomorrow, does he need to pick 3 pounds? No. He needs to pick 3 pounds, 6 ounces. And if he falls short again, you know what's going to happen. So typically, what happens here? You have to maintain, and if not, meet. So what happens, though, we see Kathy, all right? So Kathy maintains her numbers. In fact, she's picking 4 pounds of cotton every single day. Okay, she's doing good. She's meeting above the quota. So she's meeting above the quota. Now here's the thing. I see Kathy, you're picking 4 pounds of cotton. That's good. You're doing much more than I expected. I bet you can do 5 now. So that quota keeps going up. Now Kathy's used to picking 4 pounds, but she's never picked 5 before. So she only picks 4.7. 3 ounces short. Or sorry, she picks 4 pounds 12, it would be 4 pounds, 13 ounces. 3 short. She gets her lashes, and she needs to pick 5 pounds, 3 ounces tomorrow. So as you can see, this quota system just keeps going up and up and up, which means the slaves have to work harder and harder and harder. And that's the motivation here. You're not giving them positive motivational rewards, right? So I'm not saying, hey, you know what? For every good grade you get, I'm going to give you $10. So you're going to work harder to get more and more money. That's a positive for you. In this case, you're working in the reverse. Is, hey, man, if you don't keep getting these good grades, I'm going to beat you. Okay, well, that's a problem. I'm going to take your phone away. That's a problem. I'm going to turn the lights out. I don't know what other negative reward you guys have is. I'm going to take away your hoverboard. I don't, Lakewood Ranch. But my point being here is you're working off a system of negative, consequential motivators. So your goal is to try to get them to do what you need to do. You're going to ultimately have to go and maintain a certain system or level of work to avoid a negative punishment. And that's how the system of slavery worked. Ultimately, you keep them from learning to get out of their situation, and you use violence and things like that to maintain the fear in them to keep them doing their job. This is a struggle. And this was a system that was permeated through much of the South. And over time in the North, viewpoints and ideals changed. But one of the strong arguments the South is going to have here, and this is for those of us who are paying attention when we do our virtual debate, you might want to know this, is this: cultural norms are not universal. Okay? Cultural norms are not universal. So what is seen as morally positive or negative isn't shared by everyone all over the place. There are some universal norms, right? Killing someone is wrong. Okay? Stealing is usually seen as a very negative thing. Those are what we call universal morality norms. But not all aspects of it are. And so what eventually would come into being is that the North would create these moral imperatives. We need to remove slavery. It's unjust. It's unconstitutional. It's unbiblical. And in the South, they viewed it differently. They said, well, it's an agricultural system that has been used for hundreds of years, and if not thousands of years, by people. Slavery is found in the Bible, and it also states in the Bible that a slave shall not disobey or disrespect his master. So, in fact, in this, they would argue back and forth through biblical structure, biblical. I'm sorry. So they would go back and forth between literature, or not literature. I can't even think of the word. Between different parts of the Bible that would state whether or not that supported their narrative of yes, slavery is good, or it supported the narrative of slavery is bad. So you're going back and forth. Ultimately, this will be the fight that would be ultimately had even at the constitutional level when states start seceding from the Union. You know, the North can't tell us what to do. It's not their right to tell us how we should or should not live. If you don't like slavery, don't have slavery. If you want to have slavery, have slavery. If you think back to when we did the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 last week, we were talking about the fact that many people wanted to use the term popular sovereignty, right? Let the people decide. If the state wants to have slaves, then have slaves. Okay? If you don't want to have slaves, then don't have slaves. That's your choice, ultimately. Okay? Now, here's the thing. Ultimately, what we're going to come to realize is that these long hours, this push of constant threat of violence and strenuous amounts of work and lack of access to education kept these people in place. And so if there's ever a time when we talk about, man, education is a vital part of your life, you need to focus on it, you need to grab it by the horns and go with it, education will set you free because you'll realize, well, this doesn't make much sense. I don't understand that. But if you like to live in ignorance and stupidity and just accept things as is, you'll always be kind of stuck there, right? Now, ultimately, here's where we are, because we're already almost at the end of the PowerPoint. Like I said, today's show is a little bit small, so I can go ahead and finish up your attendance for this past week. Is this in your discussion board? So in the discussion board that's on Schoology as I speak right now, in your opinion, what would have been the toughest part about being a slave, and how do you think slaves might have entertained themselves in these times? Because you have to think, there was downtime. And in fact, when we go later into this unit, because like I said, this is a very blanket introductory PowerPoint into the concept of slavery. We have to understand how they got here, what cultural norms did they bring from not just Africa, but from the Caribbean, which is where many slaves actually really originated from. Because what you would see is that they would bring them from Africa and they would start in the Caribbean, and then they would be brought into North America, into the United States over that way. So many of them have, which is why if you go to the Caribbean today, you see a large amount of African influence in these cultures and their cuisine, music, etc. So you're going to see that there is definitely not just an exchange of slaves and materials, but you're going to see cultural exchange and things of that nature. Okay, so how do you think they would entertain themselves? How do you think those things would translate into modern culture? Now, if you're going to say hip hop and rap music, because typically it's an African American centric medium, that's not necessarily true. In fact, hip hop and rap music actually originate out of rock and roll and country and bluegrass and jazz music. So you have a long line of history to get there, and you learn about the Harlem Renaissance in the 1880s and things like that to kind of get there. It's fascinating. One of my students did a history fair project that almost made it to nationals based on this. So that's actually really fascinating. So you have to understand, how do we get how what life would have been like, and just I want you to take a minute, think about all these things we talked about. Just these were very general and very minimal basic things to get you through your activity today, but just what life would have been like as a slave. And as we go through and we peel the layers of, as Shrek would say, peel the layers of this onion, realize it gets very dark, and it is very, very disheartening just what many of these slaves had to go through on just a daily basis and what they had to do. Their livelihoods, their systems. We'll talk about people like Nat Turner, who viewed himself nearly as a prophet of God that tried to free the slaves, and ultimately he failed. We'll talk about someone who outsmarted the system, like Frederick Douglass, who is one of the most famous African Americans of the 18th. He was the most famous African American of the 19th century. He was Martin Luther King before Martin Luther King. He literally convinced people to buy his freedom through writing in a series of op-ed pieces in a London-based newspaper as a slave. So this man was extraordinarily intelligent. Okay? So we want to understand the fact that there are some incredible stories and people and ideas that come out of this time, and that this dark part of American history ultimately put us down a path to having some of the most important technological, scientific, political, literary, musical innovations that our country has ever had. So ultimately, what do you guys think? In your opinion, what would you thought would be the toughest part about being a slave? I mean, yes, the beatings, the threat of physical violence is scary, but think about it, that's surface level, temporary. There's a deeper psychological, mental state that we need to compare. If someone told you 5 months ago that we would be stuck at home and not able to go to school, you guys would be like, cool. But as we now have been sitting here now for the last month, really, I mean, think about it. The last time we were in school was March 12th, and it's April 6th now, so it's almost been a month of being at home. There is a psychological, aspect to this entire quarantine that goes very left understated. So you can one day will grow up and tell your kids, like, yeah, I remember the pandemic of 2020 and what it was like. And they're going to be like, well, you got to sit at home and watch Netflix all the time. If Netflix is still a thing, they probably won't even remember it. But you would say, yeah, it wasn't that easy. I mean, there was a constant threat of fear and a lack of knowing and, worry and all these things coming on. I mean, I could tell you just having a personal conversation here. I mean, my wife is on the front line. She's a nurse. My wife is an LPN who works in a clinic in Lakeland, Florida, and she has had 3 people test positive that she's had to go and test and work on, and she fortunately has the PPE, the personal protective equipment that is needed to keep us safe, and she has to keep herself safe, and she has to be checked every day, and it is scary for my family and for people around, and everybody has to take good time on their hands. So ultimately, we just want to make sure that everyone's safe. So it's not just staying at home. There's a whole mental aspect to this day-to-day sitting at home and being cooped, really what it feels like being cooped up in this house all the time, sitting in front of this, there's actually 3 screens in front of me, but sitting in front of these 3 screens every day and doing these things with you guys. So yeah, that went down a really deep emotional tangent, but at the same time, what I really want you guys to focus on when you guys do your discussion board, and I really want you to think about it, because some of these discussion boards, some of you guys are doing a great job when it comes to discussion boards. Some of you guys are just doing the bare minimum just to get by, and your grade will be reflected accordingly. I can tell when someone puts, yo, I agree, dog, that's not going to get you full credit. That's going to get you actually probably less than what you probably deserve, because now I'm frustrated with you because you're not taking it seriously. But I really want you to sit down and think, what would have really been the hardest part, the toughest part about being a slave. So at this point, I will take some question and answers before we move on, and I let you guys loose on the discussion board. Tomorrow, you guys will have the Reading Like a Historian on Nat Turner, because we're going to do a whole PowerPoint on Nat Turner and how we get there. But if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns about today's PowerPoint, now is the time to do it. I'm going to have a conference at 7 p.m., okay? I'm going to be conferencing at 7 p.m. to answer questions. I know it's really late. I know it's around dinner time, but I've got a lot of stuff to get done for your guys' attendance and all that fun stuff. But at 7 p.m., I'll say it again, 7 p.m. tonight, I will be doing a conference. And if you guys have any questions that you want answered there, we can do it there. But again, 7 o'clock p.m. tonight here, I will be answering questions. So are we going to have all of this for a test? No, that's a great question. There is going to be a test coming up. I'm debating whether it's going to be on Friday or that's too soon. It's probably going to be Tuesday next week is ultimately the day I'm going to probably put this test on. I don't want to do it on a Monday. Monday is going to be a review, and I'll do a Kahoot game live with you guys on Monday, but we are going to have a test on Monday, and it is not going to feature anything on slavery. Slavery will be a quiz that'll be given later down the road. Your test on Tuesday next week will ultimately be on Manifest Destiny and Westward Expansion. So, Manifest Destiny and all the compromises of 1820 and 1850. So you need to know all that stuff. So that's a great question, Noah. Is there going to be a test? Yes, it is going to be a test. It is going to be on Schoology. So you guys will be able to do that then. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns? Is a Schoology conference or a live stream? It will be a Schoology conference. Will this PowerPoint be on Schoology? If I'm not mistaken, it is currently on Schoology. Let me just check to make sure real quick. Schoology. Oh, all right, I didn't hit add. All right, click. And it is now on Schoology. It is currently on Schoology as we speak. Hold on. I lost my screen. There's my screen. Okay. It is on Schoology. Also, we don't have school on Friday because, it's Good Friday this week, and which is a part of the Easter holiday for Christians. But I will also say that the school had the day off anyway. We technically don't have school, so I will not be doing any type of mandatory streaming. I might just stream myself playing Call of Duty or something because I'll be bored and I'll need to do something. You only have daycare Friday. Okay, well, we'll be all home. Maybe I'll have Brody and I will play some Call of Duty and see how that goes. It'll go terribly, just letting you know. Heads up. Spoiler alert. Whew. So, yeah, Tuesday next week we will do our quiz, or test, sorry. That one is a test, and that will be on Manifest Destiny. So all of your Manifest Destiny notes, even way back to when we were in school, including your notes on the Compromise of 1850, Rise of Sectionalism will be there. You should get Rainbow Six. I'm not very good at Rainbow Six, so I don't want to waste my money on that. Plus, I've got a game coming out on... Actually, it comes out on Friday that I've been looking forward to since I was 11 years old. So, we'll see. When are you putting a story time? This weekend was a little bit crazy. We had a little arts and crafts. We made some paintings with my son yesterday, so it took into the time. Story time should be going up this week. Okay, Connor, you made it just in time for me to leave. So sorry, Connor, you made it just in time for me to hold on down. So yeah, story time will be this week as well. I will have time to film it tomorrow because today is going to be all hands on deck grading, all hands on deck getting your attendance done from this last week. All of us teachers are trying to struggle and make it in there. Now, if you also know anybody who's struggling to see any of these videos or things like that, if you're struggling with any of these people who are, if you know anyone who's really struggling to get these videos and things like that, please let me know. And because I know there's certain kids who I see on the daily, that come in here and do these, and then there are some kids who I have not heard from since we left in March. So hopefully, I really hope everyone's doing a good job. We are trying to get anything National Junior Honor Society up off the ground, because there's just a lot of work going on. It seems like we don't do as much. I mean, I don't know what you guys are doing, but I know from our end, it's crazy. Trying to take everything I do teaching wise and make it into a online platform in terms of the actual lesson giving like we did today. A lot of conversation about video games, and this is where it turns to. So, on that note, once again, 7 o'clock p.m. Keep me honest, too, because if I don't jump on, get on Remind and scream at me. Mr. Robinson, you'd say we'd conference at 7. We are going to conference at 7. 7 p.m. tonight. We're going to go ahead and we'll look up, see what game comes out on Friday. Connor, you'll figure it out. It's definitely really dorky and nerdy, so leave me alone. So, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for dropping in. Once again, if you have any questions, you will see we'll be we'll be conferencing at 7. We'll have our stream again tomorrow, 11:45 in the morning, and we'll be good to go. So once again, guys, thank you for coming on. Hopefully everybody's staying happy, healthy, safe. I know our family is doing what we can. So let me know. Have a good day, guys. Pew, pew. Oh, there you go. Bye.